Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our panel. It's a privilege to present here at the CSA Zero Trust Summit. I've got a whole suite of distinguished engineers and professionals I'm very quite eager for you to meet. And we've got a number of topics we want to talk about that you will find engaging and hopefully learn something and take away from this. Our panel is called Zero Trust for Critical Infrastructure and Operational Technology. Protecting critical assets. So, of course, it's about zero trust, but really focusing on the unique aspects of applying a zero trust strategy to operational technology, critical infrastructure, industrial control systems, and the like. I would love for folks to just do an introduction. I'll start with myself and then hand it off. I'm Josh Woodruff. I'm a member of the Cloud Security Alliance Zero Trust Working Group. I'm also founder and CEO of MassiveScale.ai. We're focused on AI transformation with a security-first lens, specifically zero trust lens for AI implementation. Philip, would you mind introducing yourself next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Josh. So, Philip Griffiths within the CSA, I co-lead the Zero Trust Networking Group, co-author a few papers, including Software-Defined Perimeters v3, microsegmentation, and there's a few more coming out as well. Outside of the CSA, I look after strategic sales for NetFoundry. We provide identity-first networking across many use cases, including OT and critical infrastructure.
Fantastic. Thank you, Philip. Highly recommend you dig into Philip's content. It's got some great stuff out there. Matt, would you mind going next?
Hi, I'm Matthew Rogers. I lead the Secure by Design work for operational technology here at the CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. Prior to this, I was the founding engineer at a company doing intrusion detection systems and bolt-on security solutions for planes, trains, and tanks.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Danielle has also joined us. She goes by DJ. DJ, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, y'all. Danielle Jablansky. I do go by DJ across the board typically. I'm the lead for OT cybersecurity consulting at an engineering firm known as STV. We're very big in rail, aviation, buildings, and the judicial and education space. Before that, I was on Matt's team actually at CISA, where we led the strategy for industrial control systems security in the Office of the Technical Director at CISA. And my background is also in continuous monitoring and solution development across the OT ecosystem. And feel free to reach out on LinkedIn and find me elsewhere if you want to connect.
Thank you, DJ. And last but not least, we have Teddy with us. Teddy, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody, or middle of the day for the CSA conference at this point. My name is Theodore Gates. I'm a cybersecurity strategist and architect at Foxhole Technology, focused mostly on applying the tenets and principles of zero trust across the private sector, federal agencies, research and educational institutes. We focus a lot on advancing practical, scalable security models across diverse, complex environments. My focus tend to be in the operational technology, industrial control systems, enterprise networks, and cloud convergence.
Thank you so much. What an amazing group of folks we have here covering so many different industries, public and private. Well, let's get into it. We've got a few questions prepared and would love to hear from each of you. I think one of the areas we wanted to love to dive into is just starting with the Purdue model. Purdue model is a pretty well accepted framework and architecture known well throughout OT and operators. I think there's some debate with the Purdue model. While it's been foundational for OT security governance, I've heard several of you talk about it becoming prescriptive and inflexible, both within this group as well as out in the industry. We even write about that within some of our CSA papers. And there's kind of some doubt as to, or debate, not really doubt, but where zero trust realistically stops. How far down that model can it go? Oftentimes we say 3.5, what's known as the DMZ, or can we push it down to the cell, even to the PLC? How do we move beyond Purdue as a rigid blueprint while preserving the operational clarity and safety boundaries that make it applicable? I think that's really where I'd love to start. Matt, can you kick us off on this one? Do you have an opinion on this? What do you think?
Ideally, we do go below 3.5 and we start exploring what defense in depth really looks like for OT environments, right? I think treating these networks as a bubble where we can't put security in and we just have to hope that nobody gets past it just can't work, right? Like it really defies a lot of the zero trust principles, but it's also just not very resilient. Where I do think Purdue is really useful is from how we speak about it, right? I mean, you'll find us throughout this conversation, we'll refer to things as layer 3.5, layer 3, layer 2, where layer 1, rather than treating it as an architectural model, it's a better reference model. It helps us clearly explain like where roughly do we expect things to be? What sort of function are they doing? But like that's the main use case for it.
Thank you, Matt. I'd love to hear, Philip, from you as well. I know you've got a lot to say about this as well as a couple others. What do you think? What's your take on this?
I'm going to reiterate what I just heard Matthew say, which is it's a classification model. It's not how we do secure communications or how we necessarily design our networks. And so for me, the shift of how we bring zero trust into OT and map it to Purdue means a conceptual shift where we actually take the ideas of 62443 ISA, that is, of conduits rather than networks. How do we build secure communication flows based upon zero trust principles of identity to asset to then port protocol to the duration of the policies, rather than, hey, I'm going to set up a VLAN, or I'm going to reconfigure some IP addresses, or I'm going to set up some firewall rules. I don't think that traditional model gives us the defense in depth and security that we want. And I think being able to deliver identity defined, zero trust constrained conduits just makes it much easier to enable the digitalization of OT while preserving operational safety. To me, the default should be this comes to the edge of the cell, and anything in or out of the cell should be either identity driven conduit rather than via a jump server in 3.5. But potentially you can, in some scenarios, also bring that down to the PLC, at least if it's a more modern one and it can support identity and software being installed on it.
Completely agree. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the ISA 62443 Philip mentions, it talks about a zone and conduit model. This actually maps quite well to the 5-step zero trust implementation process we talk about within Cloud Security Alliance. It really came from John Kindervag and the NSTAC report to the president. So there's a lot of congruency there, but the question of carrying it down, I think, it's a gray area. So love that explanation, Philip. Teddy, I would love to hear any input that you have on this topic. What do you think? How far down can we take this? How does it apply, and how do you map these two?
One of the things that gets lost in the conversation, I think, is what Philip and Matt are referencing is we're looking at a hierarchical model when it comes to architecture in regards to Purdue. And that is, while useful for classification purposes, it doesn't necessarily map to how we're doing the actual convergence of our enterprise IT environments and the operational technology that we have currently. The nice beauty of zero trust is that it being a principled framework is supposed to be flexible and can be adapted anywhere in your environments, right? Trying to map those direct models and layers to various aspects, it doesn't get us the results that we are necessarily looking for unless you start having that cultural shift that Philip was referencing, where you're starting to view things slightly different. Zero trust in its inset was a framework for cybersecurity. When I talk towards this conversation, I like to pull people away from when they're talking towards, we get stuck at 3.5, we get stuck, can we get down to the PLCs? Is how do you look at zero trust if you were to remove the cyber focus on this, right? So if you were just to take the tenets of zero trust and apply security at a larger scale. So the concepts of never trust, always verify, assume breach, segment our environments as we can. If you were to take the cyber tooling out of things, you could get to no one's granted access to a restricted area without first confirming their identity and authorization. Any individual who works in a building, not automatically allowed to secure areas without explicit current IDs and checks by the guards in place. You assume breach, the design of your infrastructure, the design of your operational plans, they are built with the assumption that intruder is already inside. So your procedures are to limit the blast radius, focus on containment, ensure the intruder can't move across to other locations within your facilities. Your access is simply being focused on dividing it into many smaller zones, locked areas, instead of fewer larger ones. So a lot of our operational technology, our industrial control environments are very flat, built 50 plus years ago, focused on making sure everything connects. So I like to approach this from a perspective of when you're looking at those models and zero trust, how can you practically attack these things? And when you start removing that cyber focus, you can start seeing, your challenges are going to be there, and you can start moving to mitigation strategies. Like start with your perimeter segmentation that's at the external and move slowly in towards your critical assets, employer monitoring, and those toolings with the various tenets that you actually need to be focused on.
There was a couple of things that you said there, Theodore, that I just agreed with so much. the idea of Purdue was created before the internet was popular. And that is why this is so critical now, because IT/OT convergence, digitalization, you can't just air gap things. And some organizations are going to the extreme, saying, hey, I won't let my vendor have access because I need critical control. But then that means you lose all the benefits of digitalization. So for me, bringing zero trust into OT and mapping it into a Purdue environment enables you to wrap a governance flow around identity driven conduits so that you can provide asset or service based communication and the underlay just stays simple and unchanged because no one wants to have to re-IP a factory.
I completely agree. And one of the reasons I like to extract the cyber from the conversation, especially in these environments, one of our most frequent challenges I get put up with in applying zero trust or modern cyber tends to come down what's your impact going to be on your operations itself, right? Take one of the probably most consistent challenges we run into, performance constraints on your legacy operational technology devices, your legacy control systems. Something that can make granular segmentation and monitoring extremely difficult. Implementing that deep packet inspection on the environments or what we're used to in the cyber world of agent-based monitoring puts resource constraints on everything we're working with that just impacts performance and availability, and we cannot have that in these locations. But instead, what we can do is employ passive monitoring, analytics for anomaly detection, and things that are no longer in line, but are instead mirroring, tapping, watching what's happening so we can react and limit the blast rate of those attacks when they occur.
There's something you said there, which I think is so critical as well in the whole zero trust for OT. You can't just take off the shelf IT technologies and go, let's just throw it into the factory. Like it's a whole different mindset where you have to think about safety and availability first. And that means picking certain tools and strategies that fit.
Focus on the outcomes we're looking from for these solutions in these environments, as opposed to what's the shiny that can be brought in.
No matter what vendors try to tell you, you can't go buy zero trust. And whatever you buy, the same thing for IT is not going to work for OT. I think just a couple key points before we pivot off that. Okay. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I wanted to talk a little bit about another challenge in OT and something that speaks to what Philip mentioned with safety and reliability, really around human-centered zero trust, designing for the plant floor, not just the security operations center or the SOC. As Philip alluded to, safety and reliability operators work in high stress, safety critical environments where milliseconds matter. That's why you heard Teddy talk about you can't really get in line. You can't add encryption to some of these lower level 50-year-old things. You will break it. And sometimes that breaking can jeopardize safety of human lives. What does human-centered zero trust actually look like in OT? I mean, beyond the training, beyond MFA that folks may be used to, how do we design controls that work for the person on the plant floor and not just the SOC? Matt, would love to hear from you first. What do you think about this?
I like to think of it as we often talk about how we have like a training problem and a workforce shortage problem from a cybersecurity perspective. But I think it would be far more useful to frame it as, are we designing things that are just fundamentally hard for people on the plant floor to use? So we're like exacerbating the existing problem of workforce shortages. And in reality, it's not as bad if we could just build in some of these human-centered design components. Maybe the best way to think about it is in terms of like rules of thumb for OT and what we think is sort of hard or impossible, but are really just like engineering challenges that require conversations or things have been made arbitrarily hard for people. So one example of this is, of course, we like don't encrypt OT networks. It's like the rule of thumb. It could break something, as you just said, with like the 50-year-old component. And that rule of thumb leads to people just not doing any of these controls and like immediately in their head thinking of the hardest version of the problem. So we interviewed 20 plus owners and operators about like, hey, why do you not use secure communication technologies? Things like the secure version of Modbus or DMP3 has existed for literal decades. So why don't people use it? And now it gets complicated, right? Like some of it is on the standard and on the protocol, in that it does require a lot of a knowledge of PKI and key management from the operator, people who are not necessarily skilled in this. They could learn it, but they've got a million other things to do. And then part of it is more of like, how is the system actually designed and how do people think of security in these environments? And it just becomes not the priority because, we would talk to operators and they would say, okay, well, I thought about it from a security perspective, and I could just buy a security monitoring, continuous monitoring tool, or I could do secure communication, and it's a easier trade-off for me. Like it's a more predictable cost. It's an easier way to think about the problem to just put monitoring in place than it is for to actually do the nitty-gritty hard problem of secure communication, just because of system management. But if you really think about that, right, like it is easier to buy a third-party security product, put it into the network, maybe change the architecture to support segmentation or to support a network tap, than it is to often turn on the feature that already exists in the product. For in the case of secure communication, where it does already exist, right? We are like arbitrarily putting up some barriers. And to that end, right, like, and then it becomes a matter of how do we tie some of these problems to safety. So going more into DJ's wheelhouse now, like we often think of things like MFA as like impossible, and yet we look at things like the rail market. And if you want to make a change to vital signaling logic on like a wayside interface unit, there's often something called local presence where you have to push a button physically in the device in addition to your access control. So a somewhat form of MFA, and that's just seen as a safety control. So reframing it in safety works, and it is possible in that environment. And it really just gets to the point of like a lot of the things that we take as impossible in OT, sometimes they are physically like this is a really old system, we can't do it. But sometimes it is possible, be it MFA or from more Teddy's space, right? Like, hey, we sent like over the air updates to U2s like in flight, so like a plane in the air. We sent an over the air firmware update that was secure. Those things are not in any way new, and we just did that, right? Like, and when we talk about patching being really difficult and impossible, like just think about like that framing in your mind. Like we sent it to a plane in flight and that was fine, but we can't do it to some of our other environments. It's really about the engineering processes and how we can make people comfortable with it rather than like a pure technical barrier.
Teddy, I'd love for you to chime in on this. I really about human in the loop. We've talked about a bit before when we were chatting about some of these person on the floor is a challenge that IT controls don't seem to want to fix. What are your thoughts about human-centered design in a zero trust world for OT?
I appreciate that. So going back to a piece of what Matthew was saying there earlier about whether or not what we're designing in our environments and our control sets are effective for the operators that are out there, or if they're there just to be tacked on, and whether we're considering the safety of things, right? So what I've always stressed that we need things for the operational side of the house that are still user friendly and effective in their environments, which tend to be high stress, safety critical, time critical locations that consider the needs of floor operators, right? So things that are our environments and our structures, our architectures are context aware of what we're trying to do. So our access controls are based on not just the users or the identities of the users, but we are considering the location, the operational tasks that they're inside of, right? So things that can make the access to be dynamic for the task that they are performing, as opposed to a static thing that we are used to applying towards our dynamic in the enterprise world, where you have your role-based access and whatever resource you're trying to access. Those things adjust when you're looking at that safety and availability focus of our locations. So making sure we build in those breaking glass mechanisms for the users, making sure that we make things really simple for them to notice, right? So things that aren't going to hinder the real-time responses and the risks in their emergency situations, because that's usually where these things start to break apart. So things that can delay critical actions and compromise safety, you have to put things that are going to mitigate, things that are such as clear visual cues, alerts, things that guide the security procedures and operators to minimize that confusion and simplify. Because we can't expect those people that are operating on the manufacturing floor to be well versed in how to respond to a SOC alert, despite the fact it's starting to interrupt their production line and starting to cause things down the road that are going to impact people that are right next to those conveyor belts that could cause injuries and safety problems.
You mentioned role-based access control in zero trust. We'll talk about context-based access control. What I'm hearing from both of you, it's almost even a broader set of contexts is even more important in the applicability of zero trust for OT, because there's a lot more things that could go wrong. The physical presence may be higher and safety's at risk. Anybody else want to chime on here before I pivot?
I'd love to join the
Please.
conversation, Josh. A lot of what's been said so far is really focused on this like operator division of the people first portion of technology, people, policy, and procedure that we talk about a lot in security. What I would like to remind people now that I'm a consultant again is that everyone still has to be their own trusted advisor. So a lot of times we hear a lot of marketing hype. We hear, is the Purdue model still relevant? It's a teaching mechanism. It's a hierarchy. It's not a hierarchy. You can go below 3.5 if your solutions allow for it. What we don't talk about is the fact that all of these solutions are just as purpose-built as the environment, and you have to also evaluate and verify, what these solutions provide. And so I haven't heard anyone talk about the next layer of trust in zero trust models being the ability to trust the solutions that you're actually procuring and deploying. So a lot of times we jump to say, oh, this solution or this control is kind of the answer to our problems, but we don't actually encourage people to evaluate that answer. And when we go to break down some of these controls, we have lists of, these are the top 12 for this sector or what have you. But if you were to actually pull apart a control, we have either a practice or a tool, and sometimes we have multiple within one control, like network segmentation. You could actually see network segmentation delivered to a network of networks, a system of systems that involves multiple practices and multiple tools. And when I say tools, I mean solutions. And those solutions are built by people and accessed by people. And so that next verification level needs to happen, whatever control we're talking about, and it needs to be extended to the zero trust conversation. But we also can't throw away other good practices. So when we get to the zero trust conversations, we always say, like, how far can we go? And how do we authenticate everything everywhere all the time? And I just don't think that access is the only control to consider if you're being your own advisor in this sense. And there's a reason that, Matthew already mentioned, defense in depth continues to be a best practice. It's because zero trust is also layered in terms of the pillars it does attack. And so my first reaction is always network segmentation can solve for many of the issues that zero trust actually desires to fix. And then there's proof that as a main defensive strategy, after you consider all of your best options for network segmentation, that's where you can underscore access and pivoting in a network to do more against things that are less opportunistic attacks and more tailored attacks. So there's several schools of thought on recommended practices for this. You typically hear OEMs and others say, well, put a box in front of it. So inline security solutions and appliances. Well, again, they're probably not your trusted advisor, right? So you have to go evaluate if that's what's going to work for your purpose-built ecosystem and environment. There are other solutions like Hyperport and Cyolo, and I don't mean to just like vendor drop, but it's the technologies that they're bringing to the table that need another set of verification and trust if you're going to introduce them into your model, right? If it's a strategy, we have to go find what works for us and make sure that it does what it says it does. So that's looking at things like, privileged access management and secure remote access, combining the two for this role-based, access. And there's other papers on this. And so I just want people to understand that some of the technologies that come out are solving some of the same problems that zero trust is attacking, but we still have to verify and vet if they're the right solutions for us when we move to this. Well, zero trust everywhere. If this solution says it has it, great. No, we have to verify and vet that, that technology is doing what it says it's doing. And it might also add new complexity. And so this like security by obscurity conversation that kind of went away for a couple of years is back. And I think that's a really interesting pivot as we talk about some of the human-centered design work for OT.
There was a talk at DEF CON this year around 3 zero trust networking vendors who got compromised by poor implementation of their technology. And had to open CVEs and make some fixes. And I wrote a blog on how it comes down to implementing a better architectural approach so that you can't get compromised from that aspect. And this very much speaks to I think what DJ said was you have to not necessarily have trust in the zero trust vendor. You have to look at what their controls are because you are introducing a system into your system.
I love this. I'm hearing a very consistent message across all folks who spoke to this about due diligence. Don't just take for gospel. And I do see this, I'm sure you guys do too, especially since OT is so less understood, at least in the IT world. And so even in IT, folks clamor to the checklists and the strategies as if they're gospel and I got to, follow these steps exactly. And as we talked about at the very beginning, these are strategies, they're frameworks, they're meant to be adapted and used specific to your environment. But as DJ said, there's layers and layers upon nuance and details. Never trust, always verify applies to everything that you're looking at as well. I love that, Teddy. Yeah, great points, you guys. Thank you so much. Be your own analyst. Do your own due diligence. Don't follow a checklist, especially if you don't understand OT as much. I feel like that requires even more understanding. So go deeper, shoulder up with your operators, learn their day-to-day work, figure out what they're dealing with and how security and a zero trust might impact them for whatever solution, physical, digital, whatever you're looking at. Such great messages. Thank you guys so much. Another key aspect of zero trust is we always talk about it as it's an identity-based security model. It's not a perimeter-based security model. It's an identity-based security model. You heard Phil talking about this earlier with identity and network transit. So the identity pillar is critical for zero trust. But when you're talking about OT, this really doesn't translate well, at least not neatly, to relays, controllers, PLCs, or safety systems that really can't run agents. They can't be patched. They often can't even be restarted. So what does identity actually look like for these assets? Are current identity models sufficient, or do we need a fundamental rethink for OT environments? And Matt, I'd love to start with you on this one.
I don't really think we need a rethink, is the short answer. When we were like, obviously with a lot of these existing legacy environments, like trying to get this to work is going to be quite difficult, which is why you've seen even from the protocol vendor side, right, just basically selling gateway devices to throw in front, and then they'll manage all of that identity aspect for all of the legacy solutions, and then all the future solutions will include it. The considerations that I think are different are how do you balance things like segmentation and some of your initial assumptions around how everything links together. So, we were running into some entities who were saying like, well, I can't do secure comms because then I have to connect everything back to a central certificate authority, and that breaks my segmentation policy. It's like, okay, well, from a best practice perspective, you probably would want to actually connect to a root CA, and you wouldn't want to do like self-signed certs locally. But from a maintain segmentation, maintain control, you're starting from nothing perspective, maybe you would self-sign certs and you just need to verify it. Or maybe you'd drastically change how we think about cert expiration for something that is really difficult to get access to, like a valve under the ground, than you would another component. And I think just like from a fundamental perspective, just questioning not is the identity model fundamentally different, but what are we prioritizing within it, right? Like I don't care as much about encryption. I think encryption matters, but like I would much rather prefer that the integrity of the system is fully there. I'd prefer the authenticity of the system, that you can actually say who is speaking to who. But beyond that, like, and, encryption's great, but like those are the much lower hurdles to get to. So I'd prefer that you actually end up starting there. And that's just a conversation that a lot of the industry is not super equipped to have, because we operate in this like TLS, HTTPS modern internet, where why would you ever do that is sort of the question. And OT just hasn't really tried to confront the question of, well, maybe we should do that in piecemeal. And some vendor solutions do. Like if you try to enable SIP security, for example, you can absolutely do that. You can enable it full encrypted. You can enable it with just integrity and authentication, so just message signing, or you can just turn it off completely. Right now, too many people just turn it off completely. I would love it to be more of a risk-based decision to go, well, I'll start with signing, and as I mature, maybe I'll get to encryption. But signing would be a great place to end up.
Yeah, I think we're oversaturated in the common protocols of IT, and then we're trying to impose them onto the OT world. Why aren't you doing this? While it does provide some segmentation and identity abstraction, some of it just simply won't work for OT. DJ, I'd love to hear from you on this topic. What say you about identity and OT?
Yeah, I was smirking there for a minute because when Matthew and I were on the same team, we actually broke this down in part of our roles and responsibilities of who would focus on secure communications going forward for ICS and who would focus more on legacy technologies. And I won't say who focused on what. And it's the main point is that it's important to do both because these ecosystems are going to have both for a very long time. So, of course, we know that the inability to implement restrictive or least privileged access in ICS can introduce unacceptable residual risk, period. But we also know that there are a lot of ways to build in redundancy that are not identity based. And I think it goes back to the point I made earlier about this rush to make things more complex in an already very, very complex ecosystem. There was a SANS paper I referenced earlier that talked about different ways to do zone segmentation and security. I think it was written in 2017. And it actually at the end suggested security zone user authenticated access control that would be implemented at the Windows level or an agent that would also require the least modification of the architecture itself. And I mention that because those two things going hand in hand sounds like the best option because it's the least complicated and it actually checks all of your boxes. And back to that conversation around selecting controls, it's not just the shiny new object of something that says it's going to do this crazy, new AI-enabled feature. It really is rethinking how to do things at scale. So when we talked about things like the Purdue model or specific protocols and their security features, we're not talking about the scale of the problem. And a lot of these solutions at their best are going to help you on a site-to-site basis. But when you're talking about these multinational, companies that are 24/7 operations like oil and gas or some manufacturing, those use cases are just not going to scale, essentially. I was also just reading a paper on OT network cloaking that Josh and I have talked about in the past. And I actually suggested to the authors that they change some of the way they wrote the paper to make it sound less cutting edge and more jumping on the fact that you can actually simplify OT security by applying some of these old concepts across security to OT environments. So I want to just make sure that we're not focusing on kind of leaps and bounds in the year 2025 when, we are comparing the Purdue model to AI enabled solutions. It's like, comparing the printing press to the internet. It's kind of crazy to do that. So I think we finally moved past, like Josh mentioned, perimeter security being the fence post. We've also underscored the significance of access, that it's not just an OT connection from the corporate environment we need to worry about. But I also think that we have more information now about east-west traffic. We have deeper understanding of producers and consumers in OT devices. For remote legacy devices, we've seen granular applications of role-based access controls with domain accounts and local accounts. So I just don't think that we have to adopt certain practices at scale. I think back to the nuance that the answer is not a unique one, right? It depends on the environment, the criticality, and the options and the resources of the asset owner. So I think legacy systems can be secured without access controls. I know that's a big contentious claim to make, but I've seen it. I think there are systems in development whose access controls may be targeted and exploited in the future. And I think that there's more that OEMs are doing today to find a middle ground. And I'm really happy that Matthew and others are on the bleeding edge of that as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think this tendency across the industry to over-engineer is something that we all have to actively fight. Making things more simple is harder. People don't get that. Boiling things down to simplicity is the harder thing to do. So it's almost the easy thing is we over-engineer, we make it too complex. And these OT systems are so complex to begin with. How do you get a mental model around them and try to actually secure them when it's already complex to begin with if you're just layering on more complexity? I love that message. There was a couple other things I know that we talked about. Matthew alluded to it, and you heard Danielle allude a bit to some of the vendors. I know there are some attempts to introduce identity into an OT environment without overhaul disruption and forklifting things out and disturbing the environments. I know there's some folks are doing ID cards for machines, including Siemens. We see Zscaler trying to do zero trust enabled SIM cards, connecting to a cellular zero trust edge. And I know Philip and the work that he's doing with NetFoundry gets into this a lot. So there are some vendor attempts going on to try to overlay this in somewhat of a simple way that doesn't require adding a bunch of complexity, but it does introduce inevitably a bit because you're changing the way you're applying security. But I love DJ's point about it's not always necessarily about access. But speaking of vendors, there's mixed governance and there's secure by design that we're all pushing for, thanks to folks like DJ and Matthew coming out of CISA, pushing this across and pressuring all of our providers out there to do secure by design. Critical infrastructure operators can't implement zero trust alone. And we know the vendor ecosystem has to participate. We know OEMs want 24/7 access. They want their contracts tie security to warranties, but operators need a kill switch. There's this tension. And Philip, you had mentioned a mixed governance model where everyone gets what they need. How do we push vendors towards secure by design when refresh cycles span decades? And is regulation the only lever? Are there other market incentives, architectural approaches that we're not using effectively?
It's a very difficult answer, particularly how you opened it up just at the end there, as to how we actually fix it. But fundamentally, you have different incentives and different desires from both sides, in my opinion. As you said, you have the vendors who are trying to move to the, hey, I need remote diagnostics and I want to deliver as a service model and get access whenever I need it. And then the asset owner then needs to protect their critical operations, but they also want to move to an as a service model. They want their the products that they get to be more valuable and to be managed, and to have someone say, hey, I'll give this an SLA, so it's just got uptime when you buy it. But that mandates being able to ensure, as you said, that there is the kill switch capability. They have the local control, and so it's kind of this really complicated diagram of from one aspect, the asset owner, they've got all these different OEMs, and then from the other side, the OEM has all these different asset owners, and that just is complexity everywhere across the whole market. And again, this isn't across the board, but you see some organizations just going, nope, I'll just air gap, and you won't have updates for your product, or you'll get them once per year, and I'll give you a USB stick or a CD. And no one wants that. Everyone wants to be able to have this model which can work. And to me, zero trust mapped to 62443, and I'm particularly thinking like FR1, 2, 5, 7, that gives you the ability to potentially create this mixed model where you can have identity driven conduits that don't disrupt the underlay network, that enable federation across each of the providers so that it just becomes simpler for both sides. And there's always going to be use cases that you don't apply it. Regulation definitely helps, but I think you have the incremental push to start digitalizing. Like the use case I often see within organizations, hey, we're trying to do some digital twins, or we're trying to do some agentic AI on one production line, or an engineering workstation. Great. How do we see how we can just apply this use case? Not greenfield the whole factory, but following the CSA model, what is my protect surface? How I can introduce business change, business improvement, and start making sure zero trust is built into it. I know you covered that on one of your talks, Josh, actually recently on AI. Like, you don't necessarily have to reinvent everything, but as you start building new systems, making changes, how do we make sure we have that default of zero trust principles so that we can build this governance mod, this mixed governance model that can just work and doesn't have both sides trying to fight each other?
From the system perspective, all I care about, literally all I care about, is that the critical infrastructure keeps operating. And if it can keep operating through compromise, through an actual incident, all the better, right? Assuming it can do that safely. And often what that requires, or maybe instinctually people will say, is like, well, we're going to air gap everything. But that in itself can be a brittle model because it's so difficult to do correctly. Whereas a more balanced model for this would be basically trying to understand, like, where can we maintain control on the operator end? Doing something like a reverse connect, like an OPC, where the client maintains control over how the connections go out, but still that communication is happening. It's just not 24/7 bidirectional control as maintained by the OEM. And so, that's one way, right? We can have the client have more control over the processes so that their engineering can still work, even in the event of compromise where, hey, like if there's a big natural disaster or something, much less a big cyber attack, right? Like that warranty policy doesn't matter nearly as much as recovery. And often the contract will say as such. And then from the OEM side, it becomes a question of like, what are they actually doing with that data and how does it benefit security? My favorite example of this is really just secure by default, right? Like when we hear secure by default, I think it's easy for all of us to imagine the worst version of that, which is like, I don't know, military STIGs, where like suddenly this computer is just unusable, right? We've all been in those environments. But the point of a working secure by default model is if you don't understand why people are turning off certain security features, you have no way to actually improve that process, right? This requires fundamentally a continuous feedback loop where you say, I know how secure I want this device to be. I have a threat model in 62443 parlance. I have a model security level I want to get to. I know what is on or off of the system. And you need some way of getting feedback in the product of why are people doing things. So we saw this as a result of some of our work from the Secure by Design pledge, where companies had access to the security data, say like in their cloud platforms, saying, why are people not deploying patches? If patches are automatically turned on by default, who in our customer base is turning it off? And what they did is now that they had the impetus from CISA to actually track this data, they would push out like automated updates, which maybe you probably won't want to do in an OT environment, but bear with me, of push it out to a customer base. They would monitor for what customers turn it off, and they would give them a call and they would say, why'd you turn it off? What part of the process was it? Is this engineering wise, this just doesn't work for you? Or is it actually our product has some usability flaws that we can improve on? And they found that they could get the uptake rate going based off of that. But like security community as a whole is a field that is like blessed with a like absolute lack of data in terms of why are people doing things and why are people not doing things. And the whole point of secure by design is that you have to build into the product ecosystem, right? Your product manager needs to understand why this is happening at an engineering level, at a security level, and that's what that data can be for, right? And so making sure that at the end of the day, all of this feeds back into the resiliency of the infrastructure, that it feeds back into all of this working better. But like that requires a lot of the ecosystem changes to make work.
So building a bit off what Matt was saying towards the vendor ecosystem, that's a fantastic, I would say, utopian world when we're interacting with the vendors that have this security mindset that want to give those pledges, right? But towards the concerns that you kind of mentioned earlier, Josh, Philip kind of went towards a bit as well. I would say there are two things that can be done, one for the legacy systems and one future looking. And they may seem kind of common sense, but it goes without saying that they need to be done. So for the forward-looking thing, customers, environments, the authoritative people in those locations, they incorporate security requirements into their vendor contracts and their service level agreements, right? If they don't do that, there's no reason for the OEMs to really follow through if it's not part of the contractual language. So they include specific requirements for security into the SLAs, mandatory patching schedules, security audits, incident response plans. For the legacy piece, going into piece that Matt and Phil were both pointing out, we need to do the segmentation on that equipment, do some implement some layered security approaches, make sure we have compensating controls that include environment segmentation, the intrusion detection, some endpoint protection requirements that we can put in place simply to mitigate the risks posed by those things that are 40, 50 years old, as well as those OEM vendors that aren't participating, I'll say, in what Matt was pointing out is, being secure by design, being secure in development as we move forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Teddy. Let's end our panel here on what we find work. We'll do a quick lightning round as we wrap up. Teddy, please kick us off.
Fantastic. I'll be lightning round. So I have everything. There's a lot of things that are working out there, but I think the biggest thing for me and all the environments I've been involved with, communication. Talk to everyone that's actually doing the work, as well as those that are looking for the outcomes in the vendor community. And the more we've talked, the more things have been successful in all these locations. People are willing to come to the table because everyone's end goal is to do the work that we're looking to get done and do it safely.
Love it. DJ, how about you? What's worked?
Yeah, so in my practice, I'm really focusing around competence, capacity, and then capabilities. I think we've seen the finger pointing of who owns security, especially for legacy systems and critical infrastructure, as a kind of key scapegoat go away. And I think people that are ready to secure their environments are trying to get that out of the way and do it themselves. I do kind of want to, again, be a little controversial because I think that the mixed governance model is almost, in a sense, a little elitist. Not all asset owners are in a position to even join in these conversations, and we have to remember that. But I think at the same time, there's this rationalization conversation going around about what do I already own and operate from even a network security monitoring capacity? Can I use any of that for security? Can I augment any of these identity issues or legacy issues with things that I already have in my security stack? What does an OT security stack look like? So again, that competence and capacity for what can I understand and make progress on matters just as much as capabilities. I'll say something else a little controversial and then I'll wrap up. I actually don't think the gap for introducing any good strategy, including zero trust principles, is architecture, product design, or strategy itself. I actually think in OT it's threat modeling and threat intelligence, and that's the bigger gap that we face. So maybe there's a future panel that we can all join in on that one, but those are my 2 to 4 to 6 cents on that.
Love it. Thank you, DJ. Philip, how about you?
One of the things that I've seen work really nice, at least the engagements I'm involved in, is understanding where the organization has problems and where they're looking to actually make changes and have budgets. Very often an organization might have budget over here and they can introduce a platform or technology that helps them to solve 4 or 5 problems that they have across the wider organization, and they're going, I can't buy 5 point tools this year, or I can't make 5 different projects and implementations this year. And so figuring out where those things are, where you can tack on zero trust principles onto the changes that you're looking to make anyway, means you align kind of the possibly the technical and operational changes to where the business strategy is actually going and being funded.
Fantastic. And Matthew, please, what have you found is working out there?
Tie security testing to interop testing. If it doesn't work together, it's not going to work from a security function. If the security function doesn't work for interop, people are not going to blame the vendor. They're going to blame the security protocol. Please don't let them blame the security protocol. You're just hampering down all of security. So make sure that interop is tied into everything here.
Well, what an amazing closing statement. Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank all of you for taking your time and sharing all of your experience and wisdom. I hope our listeners got a lot out of this. I certainly did. I love talking with you folks. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody. And thank you for watching our session.